My client arrived at the US-Mexico border undocumented and seeking asylum. He was allowed to pursue his case in the US immigration court system. However, he was detained without bond through the entire process. He was originally from Somalia. My client was moved from a jail at the southern border to a jail in southern Ohio, and finally to a jail in upstate New York. And this is where he had his final immigration hearing. He was required to find his own legal representation for this process. After credibly testifying about his kidnapping and torture at the hands of a terrorist group, Al-Shabaab, in his own country, recounting his father's murder at the hands of the same terrorist organization, presenting a live witness to these events and over 400 pages of supporting documents, including reports from our own State Department. My client watched as the prosecutor for the US government, yes, we have prosecutors in our immigration courts, held up a map of Somalia and said to the immigration judge, "Your Honor, he came from this part of Somalia, and he could just move to this part of Somalia." And the immigration judge agreed, denied my client's application for asylum, and ordered him deported to a country where we don't even have an embassy because of our fear of terrorist activity. Now, my client's case was appealed, and eventually he was released, but on a technicality, and it took almost 2 years. Now, some of you might be surprised to hear that my client who arrived at the US-Mexico border came all the way from Somalia. And before we had this presentation, we asked you to answer a poll. And the first question was about where you think most asylees and refugees are coming from. Now, we've had a little bit of technical difficulty with our answers. I don't think they come from Michigan. But let's talk about the top 5 countries where asylees and refugees are coming from. We could have that slide. Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. Most people don't know about that. And we are talking in the millions. And clearly, this is not arriving at our southern border. So the US is dealing with a very small percentage of these cases. Now, where does this misconception come from? Well, in the US, there's a lot of confusion about what an asylee is. Well, an asylee is a refugee, just under a different name. If you want protection from the US government, there are 2 paths that you can take. 1, you can request asylum. 2, you can request refugee status. So what's the difference? Location. An asylum applicant files within the United States and will either have a non-adversarial interview process or a highly adversarial immigration court process. A refugee files at a US embassy or consulate abroad, usually with the assistance of the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, UNHCR, and after staying in a refugee camp. So location is different, but they both have the same legal requirement. They must show that they are a person who is unwilling or unable to return to their country of origin due to past persecution or a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Despite having the same fears, the same legitimate evidence about persecution, Many asylum applicants in the immigration court system are treated like criminals. Of our immigration court system, a retired immigration judge said, "It is like handling death penalty cases in a traffic court setting." What did she mean by that? Well, our second question to you was what you thought the approval ratings were for asylum applications annually in the United States. And most of you were right. Very few are actually approved. In fact, most are denied, and in some immigration courts, almost all of them are denied. And by the way, those numbers, those rates of approval continue to drop. It's as if the asylum seeker in the immigration court and other areas is telling a story that just doesn't resonate. And we have to find a way to make their stories matter.
As it turns out, there is a way for these stories to matter. I'm a physician who works in a local community health center, and I'm often witness to the testimony of those who have survived trauma. Trauma leaves a lasting legacy on the physical. This imprint is something that I could observe and I could use to help guide treatment and move someone towards a better state of health. However, my duty does not stop there. The German physician and anthropologist Rudolf Virchow once described physicians as the natural attorneys of the poor and said that we should be actively engaged in helping to solve and combat social problems. For me, enacting this social responsibility, there's no perfect way to do it than to work with immigration attorneys. In working with immigration attorneys, I can help advocate for the most vulnerable and the most marginalized of my neighbors. This can make a big difference. Judges routinely are going to ignore mountains of evidence that an immigrant cannot safely return to the country from which they started. One piece of evidence that's really difficult for them to ignore is a medical or psychological evaluation that helps tell their story in terms of its impact on their health. This is something that to a judge, it can humanize the person in front of them. It can make them realize that this person, in fact, does meet the criteria for a refugee. This person should be granted asylum. In fact, there are studies that show that this works. There was a recent study that showed that of asylum cases that include a medical or a psychological evaluation, more than 70% were granted asylum. Look at our national rates, that's a pretty impressive difference. So we know that this works. We also know from recent studies that immigration attorneys would love to include an evaluation in all of their asylum cases if it were relevant. So why does this not happen more often? There's two reasons. The first is that as a physician, we're not routinely trained to work with attorneys, especially immigration attorneys, to advocate for individuals in this way. The second is cost. Doing these evaluations can take a significant amount of time and energy and can end or even thousands of dollars. Many of them have already spent thousands of dollars on legal representation, and some of them don't even have work authorization, so they cannot legally work at a job in order to pay these bills. This leaves many, many individuals, particularly the most vulnerable, without this opportunity. This is why a partnership such as ours is so critical. We're able to partner together a nonprofit pro bono immigration law center with a medical evaluation team that in the name of education is able to offer these evaluations for free. So together we can work to advocate for these clients. Meantime, we're also helping train the next generation of physicians to provide the service for other clients and other attorneys in the future. Now, The ways that we work together are not limited only to asylum cases. Let me tell you about how we first started partnering. There was a client of the Immigrant and Refugee Law Center, and he was seeking legal relief and legal assistance to help with a citizenship application. There's a long list of things that people need to do in order to obtain citizenship in the United States. This man was from Iraq. He was highly educated, he was highly skilled, and he assisted the United States military in our efforts and our campaigns in Iraq. Once our military started to withdraw, it was not going to be safe for him to be able to stay there because of his assistance to our military. So him and his immediate family were granted special immigrant visas. They were able to come to the United States and establish a new home here. After several years, the political situation had not changed. It was not safe for them to return home, and there was no end in sight to when it would be safe for them to return home. So they started applying for citizenship. This man watched as his immediate family members went up, they recited the oath of allegiance, and they became United States citizens. But he was left behind. Why was he left behind? Because like many of our troops, he had suffered a head injury while serving with our military due to an explosive device. He was referred to our medical team. I was able to interview him. I was able to use validated tools to assess his memory, assess his cognition, and then review his medical records. I was able to take this information and use this to justify that there was a medical reason that this man could not pass the civics exam, which was the only thing holding up him for citizenship. He could not pass this test. He was then given accommodations for this test, and he passed. Later, he stood up there with his family by his side, was able to recite the oath of allegiance to the United States and become a United States citizen. And he was not going to have to be separated from his family, which was his biggest fear. Now, attorneys and physicians, we have the privilege to have a lot of power to be able to help immigrants and refugees, but we're not the only ones who can help. When a family suffers an event that makes them have to leave their beloved homeland, and they're in a new country, there's a big adjustment that can happen. They're in a society, there's a new culture, and they need some assistance in navigating that. There are resettlement agencies across the United States that are looking for volunteers. If you want to make a meaningful difference in the life of a refugee family, the resettlement office. And if that's not enough for you, there is another way to help. You can actually sponsor an immigrant to be able to come to the United States. This would allow them to be able to leave the dangerous situation that they're in and seek refuge here. If you'd like to learn more about that opportunity, you can go to the USCIS website.
There's any number of ways that we could fix our broken immigration system, but offering refugees and asylees a fair playing field in this process is where we should begin. After all, many of our families came to this country seeking a fresh start. Our last question on our poll was about you and your family origins. Let's see what you had to say about that. Now, as you can see, your families came from all over the world. And in some instances, your families left countries where it was no longer safe for them to remain. We want asylees and refugees currently coming to this country to be treated with compassion, respect, and to have their stories matter. Here's a picture of a family at a refugee camp in post-war Europe. This is my family. I am the child of a refugee. My grandparents and their children left their home in Latvia and stayed in this camp for over 4 years while they waited for someone in America to sponsor them. And I'm here today because somebody did. Thank you.